Hi, Mark Donovan here from Falcon Imagery, and today I'm going to go over the topic of how to use a crosswind component chart to determine what runway to take off and to understand if you are going to be exceeding your max demonstrated crosswind component for your aircraft. All right, let's get into it. How to use a crosswind component chart. So first of all, why do we need to determine the crosswind component? An aircraft can only support a certain amount of crosswind component when taking off and landing. It's listed in the pilot operating handbook for the aircraft, and it's stated as the maximum demonstrated crosswind component. Here we have a snippet from the POH for a PA-28161 Piper Warrior. And as you can see here, it says it's 17 knots, max crosswind component that's been demonstrated. So consequently, we need to determine the crosswind component prior to takeoff and landings. If the crosswind component, the wind component moving perpendicular to the runway, is too strong, even with full rudder deflection, we may not be able to keep the nose of the aircraft aligned longitudinally with the runway while landing. If we attempted to land with a crosswind component that exceeds the pilot operating handbook's maximum demonstrated crosswind component, we would likely damage the aircraft and have a runway excursion. So let's talk about figuring out what runway to take off and land from based on certain wind conditions. So here we are, KLCI or Laconia Airport, and we listen to the AWOS, and it reports surface winds are 300 at 20 knots. If you hear it, by the way, it's magnetic heading. For example, if we hear it off the AWOS or ASOS. If we read it, then it's a true heading that we're getting for the wind direction. And that'd be something like we're reading the METAR. And so we'd have to determine the magnetic variation and factor that in to get the actual magnetic heading of the wind if we were reading a METAR. But here in this example, or next few examples, we're assuming that we are listening to the AWOS. And so what we're hearing is the magnetic heading. So based on the winds, we will take off runway 26. Why? Because we always want to take off and land with at least some headwind component. Thus, runway 8 or 080, the reciprocal of runway 26, 260, wouldn't make sense to use based on the winds of 300 at 20 knots. Again, we don't want to take off with a tailwind or some tailwind component. So what are the headwind and crosswind components for the current winds? Well, we're going to have to use a crosswind component chart to find out. So let's go over this example here, this example 1. Let's superimpose the runway 26, vertically over the crosswind component chart here shown on the right. And again, the winds are 300 at 20 knots. Then we want to determine the difference between the reported wind direction and the runway 26. So we take the difference between 300 and 260 and we get 40 degrees. We'll then move across the top of the chart to the 40-degree line. And then we'll move downward on that 40-degree line until we intersect the 20-knot arc. That's the surface winds that we're hearing. Then we'll draw a straight line down from there to the horizontal cross component axis and read that value. The crosswind component reads 12 knots. And so since it's less than 17 knots demonstrated, we can fly. We'll then draw a straight line across from the 20-knot arc to the vertical headwind component axis and read that value. And we'll see that it reads 15 knots. So we're going to have a headwind component of 15 knots and a crosswind component of 12 knots in this example. And we were within the specs of the POH for the max crosswind component, so we're able to fly. Let's look at example 2. Again, let's superimpose runway 26 vertically over the crosswind component chart, and we'll note that the winds are 320 at 25 knots in this example. So we're going to take the difference between the reported winds and the runway heading that we plan to take off of, and 320 minus 260 is 60 degrees. We'll move across the top of the chart so we see the 60-degree line. We'll then move down that 60-degree line until we reach the 25-knot arc. And then we'll draw a straight line down from there to the horizontal cross component axis and read the value. We read 22 knots. Since this is in excess of the 17 knots max demonstrated crosswind component for the pilot operating handbook of this aircraft, we can't fly. We would not be able to keep that aircraft longitudinally lined up with the runway on takeoff or landing. So again, lastly, we'll then draw a straight line across from the 25-knot arc to the vertical headwind component axis and read that value, and we see that the headwind component is 14 knots. Let's look at another example. Let's superimpose your runway 8 vertically over the crosswind component chart. And again, in this example, we see the winds are 150 at 17 knots. Then determine the difference between the reported wind direction and runway 8. Well, 150 minus 80 gives us 70 degrees. So we have a 70 degree wind direction relative to runway 8. If we had used runway 26 in these wind conditions, the difference would have been 260 minus 150 or 110. That tells us we've got a tailwind. And again, we really want to try to avoid taking off with tailwinds or landing with tailwinds. So we'll move across the top of the chart until we see 70 degrees. And then we'll move down that 70 degree line until we reach the 17 knot arc. Then we'll draw a straight line down from there to the horizontal cross component axis and read that value. And we'll read 16 knots. Well, it's less than the 17 knots max demonstrated crosswind component, so we can fly. Again, we'll then draw a straight line across from the 17 knot arc to the vertical headwind component axis and read that value. And we see we have a headwind component of 15 knots. So again, these conditions are great to fly, but taking off runway 8. Well, what do we do when we don't have a crosswind component chart available to us? And this happens a lot when you're taxiing down the taxiway and the winds have changed direction a little bit, and you go, is this going to be a problem or not? Well, there's some rules of thumbs we can use to kind of guesstimate what the winds are. And they're conservative, so if you have no other chart or data available, use these more conservative rules of thumb. So use this general rule of thumb for estimating crosswind components when you don't have access to a crosswind chart. If the difference between the reported wind direction and the runway is 30 degrees, assume 50% of the reported wind speed is crosswind component. If the difference between the reported wind direction and the runway is 45 degrees, then assume 75% of the reported wind speed is crosswind component. If the difference between the reported wind direction and the runway is 60 degrees or more, assume 100% of the reported wind speed is crosswind component. And anything in between you can interpolate as just a general guideline. So that's how we use a crosswind component chart to determine the crosswind component and headwind component for the wind direction and wind speed based on the runway we plan to take off of. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you did, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you get notified on my next video.